Well, now from immigration and climate to diversity and justice, Donald Trump's shakeup of American policy is having a dramatic impact in Washington and beyond. Our next guest, former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou, believes the president is disregarding the rule of law. In his latest piece for Slate magazine, he writes that in Trump's first 100 days, he's ignored judges, extorted law firms, and fired lawyers. Why? Ballou says disloyalty to the president. He sits down with Michel Martin to discuss the mass exodus from the Department of Justice, how the MAGA base might be positioning to take over the D.C. bar, and what all of this means for the law in America.
Thanks, Bianna. Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you.
So you're a former federal prosecutor, and you've been writing a lot and talking a lot about what you see as efforts to politicize major institutions, particularly legal institutions. So I just want to start with some recent news. More than 100 attorneys recently left the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division after being told the department would now be prioritizing President Trump's cultural agenda instead of previous priorities like, voting rights, policing sort of oversight. It's not unusual when an administration changes, priorities change, right? What is different about this? What is different about this that has caused this mass exodus of career employees?
Yeah. So I think that, as you said, administrations change, priorities change, and normally career staff will stick around between administrations, whether they're Democratic or Republican. I think what's different here is not just that it's a more extreme agenda. The new Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights says that she's going to go after, so-called DEI policies, anti-Christian bias and things like that. I don't think it's just the extremism of the politics, but also what this administration has messaged about the rule of law more generally. The president, the vice president, various members of the cabinet have all made clear that they don't particularly plan to follow court orders. And in fact, they already aren't. And so I think if you're a career staffer, you have to think about, do I want to be a part of an administration that doesn't necessarily respect the rule of law? And if I don't, how can I be most effective in resisting it? And I think that's what these resignations were about.
Well, what's interesting also is that this is President Trump's second stint in office, not continuous, obviously. But many of these attorneys did serve during the first Trump administration. What is it that they have said, or what is it that they have signaled that would cause people, for some of whom have served in the government for decades, to say that this is the line that I can't cross?
So I can't speak to the internal deliberations within the Department of Justice, but let's focus specifically on the Civil Rights Division. What you've seen is a dismantling of years of work by career lawyers to try to bring justice to some of the poorest and most disadvantaged people in America. You look at the settlement agreement that they reached with Lowndes County, Alabama, that would remediate the fact that historically Black neighborhoods didn't have sewage systems. That settlement was destroyed by the Department of Justice. You look at a case to prohibit discrimination in the Maryland State police force, that was dropped. A case to try to prevent discrimination within the Mississippi State Legislature, that was dropped. You're seeing years of work abandoned in a matter of weeks. And so I think for these career folks, it's obvious not just that this administration doesn't share their commitment to sort of the cause of civil rights as traditionally understood, but also doesn't particularly have a commitment to the institution of the Department of Justice, or like I said, to the rule of law more generally. And so I think when you're in that position, if you're a career civil servant, and I've been in this sort of position before, you have to think about what can you do to be most effective? Sometimes that's staying within government and trying to uphold the rule of law within it. And sometimes that's leaving as noisily as you can. And I think that's what these people decided to do.
The new Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, said about the exodus, and en masse, dozens and now over 100 attorneys decided that they'd rather not do what their job requires them to do. I wasn't sure how to read that. I mean, in a way, I think she might be glad, because then presumably they could put people in those positions who will be more amenable to their point of view. How did you read that?
I think that at some level, they may believe that, but at another level, this may be a little bit of a brave face on the part of the administration. The only thing the Department of Justice has, the only thing that any lawyer has is their credibility. It's the credibility to persuade a judge to rule for you, the credibility to get a jury to agree with you. And if you destroy your credibility, you will not be able to accomplish things legally. And so I think when you see a mass exodus like what we saw, just a few days ago, it suggests that the Department of Justice is bleeding out its credibility very quickly. And so, yes, maybe in the very short term, this is helpful to the new administration. They can try to staff up with folks that are more ideologically aligned with them. But in the long term, I think it's going to make it much harder for them to accomplish their agenda.
I want to turn to another issue that you've been writing about. You actually wrote a piece for Slate writing about a bid for leadership between two Trump allies, Brad Bondi, who's the brother of Attorney General Pam Bondi, and Alicia Long, who's a Trump appointee. They're running to take over, as you say, the D.C. bar. Why do you think this is important? It's not just for some sort of local issue, but you think this has real importance?
Yes, I'm grateful that you asked, and I think it's a matter of national importance. So the D.C. bar is the bar association for nearly 120,000 lawyers in America, lawyers who practice inside and outside of government. And the elections matter really for two reasons. The first is that the leadership of the D.C. bar does play a role in the disciplining of those 120,000 attorneys. So it's not direct, but the fear is that if Trump allies are able to take over the D.C. bar, they could use that as a way to punish lawyers that are seen as insufficiently loyal to the administration. So that's one fear. The other fear, and I think it's much more immediate, is that in any country facing a sort of illiberal movement, bar associations historically have been voices defending democracy, defending the justice system, defending the rule of law. You see that happen in countries like Brazil and Spain a few decades ago. And the real fear here is that if the Trump allies take over the D.C. bar, the bar will be silenced when the government acts illegally, when the government acts contrary to the Constitution. And that's one less voice standing up for democracy and for the rule of law.
So Brad Bondi was asked about this. He says, the bar has a nonpartisan mission, which I intend to vigilantly protect against any push to politicize it. My effort to run for D.C. bar president began months before the federal elections and has no connection with national politics at all. And the platform of the role is sort of apolitical. I take it that you don't really buy that.
Yeah, there are really two fears here. One fear is that Brad Bondi might be not being truthful about why he's running. He is the global co-chair of investigations for a major international law firm. He seems to have developed a rather sudden and passionate interest in free certificates of accreditation in the DC bar. I think that doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that normally interests a high-powered white-collar attorney. So it's possible that he's being disingenuous about why he's running. It's also possible that he's telling the truth, and that's just as scary. When he says that he wants to make the bar an apolitical organization, what that means is that they don't want the bar to speak out when the rule of law is under attack. And so, again, I think the risk here is that a credible institution, an institution that a lot of people believe in, could be silenced if Trump allies take it over.
Do you feel that, for example, there have been some sort of key players who have had their licenses revoked for misconduct, like Rudy Giuliani being one example? Is part of your concern that they would kind of potentially exonerate wrongdoers? Or is it really more that you're concerned that they would try to keep the bar from organizing itself as an entity to oppose other things going forward? Is that more your concern?
That's the latter concern is the immediate problem. The long-term concern is that the DC bar is involved in appointing the members to the board that handle disciplinary proceedings here in DC. And so over the months, over the years, those members would be replaced potentially with Trump loyalists. And so once you do that, then you have an enormous amount of power among over many thousands of lawyers that work in the government. And so it's a potential, where the administration cannot just fire an attorney that's deemed insufficiently loyal. But allies could potentially disbar that attorney and prevent them from working entirely. And that is really powerful leverage.
And that could be, how you think that could actually be seen as professional misconduct, not carrying out the will of the administration? One case that comes to mind is the attorney, there's the case of this Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador the administration acknowledged in court that it was an administrative error. He had a judicial order saying he was not to be deported to El Salvador, that he had a credible fear of, retaliation or harm if he were returned there, okay? Now there's been this furious fight back and forth to get him back from El Salvador because his advocates have said this is not fair, he should be returned, he should never have been deported. The administration has been saying he's a bad guy. They insist he's a gang member, even though there's no evidence that's been presented to that other than some tattoos, which is disputed. Well, here's how we know that the administration admits that it was an administrative error. Their attorney said so in court when pressed. And then this lawyer in court was suspended, or at least he was moved off the case. He was suspended and criticized publicly, saying he didn't zealously advocate for the administration's position, okay? Is that what you're worried about? Someone like that who is acting within the scope of what he considers his appropriate professional responsibility, telling the truth in court, but it's not in alignment with the administration's position, would then be literally disbarred for that?
That's the potential long-term risk. So, all lawyers have a couple of obligations. One is to zealously advocate for their client. But another, every federal government employee takes an independent oath to uphold the Constitution and also has an independent duty of candor. And so you can see how some of those obligations can come into conflict with one another. I think that case is exactly right, which is, the leadership of DOJ would have liked that lawyer to zealously advocate, presumably even if it meant eliding or distorting the truth. That lawyer, to their enormous credit, did not do that. But you can imagine a world in where Trump loyalists are able to help select members of the disciplinary board, potentially would see that as a sign of disloyalty and also as professional misconduct. So that is the long-term risk here.
People do run for the leadership of these bar associations on saying that they want to advocate for things like diversity in the legal profession, right? And so is it reasonable that somebody could also run for the head of the DC bar saying, I don't think that's your job. I think we should just stick to our knitting, which is just, whatever they consider the core responsibility, and that's all extra stuff, and that's politics. It doesn't have any place here.
Yeah.
Is that wrong?
My argument isn't that Brad Bondi that it's inappropriate for him to run for DC bar president. My argument is that we don't want the administration loyalists running the bar. And so it's entirely legitimate for him to run. It's also entirely legitimate for people to vote against him in the election, which is open until June 4th.
So one more issue, Judge Hannah Dugan in Wisconsin. This is another case that's gotten a lot of attention. She was taken into custody by the FBI on courthouse grounds for allegedly helping a man evade ICE. Judges have been arrested before for things, but is there anything about the way this was handled that stands out to you?
Absolutely. If you look at the criminal complaint here, it seems like this was an arrest made not with the intention of securing a conviction, but for securing a headline, which this administration was enormously successful at. But the legal standard to convict the judge in this case seems far beyond what the facts warrant. And so my suspicion here is that the administration is not necessarily trying to convict this judge. Perhaps they'd like it if they could, but to try to instill a certain amount of fear in judges in a very specific way, which is that ICE agents are going into courthouses to try to detain undocumented immigrants. Presumably, judges are going to be increasingly afraid to stop ICE agents from interfering in court proceedings or from roaming the halls to try to pick up undocumented immigrants, because they too are now afraid of being arrested and charged.
So there just seem to be two very different versions of what happened here. The administration seems to be arguing that Judge Dugan escorted this man out or helped him to, evade authorities or somehow helped him get out of a side door or run away, et cetera. The other version of this is that she was trying to define the scope of authority. She was in a specific legal proceeding that was unrelated to this. That matter had not been adjudicated, and she felt that he deserved his day in court on that issue and was trying to preserve the integrity of that proceeding. So those are two very different things. Now that the administration has had her arrested, saying she actually broke the law, who decides that? How does this get sorted out?
Well, now it's a criminal trial. So it's going to be decided by a judge, and if it ever has to go to trial, to a jury. I'll note that, you mentioned in the outset here that judges have been arrested before. This administration arrested a judge in the first term. Ultimately, that prosecution was dropped and referred to sort of a mere, professional disciplinary proceeding. So their track record in winning in these cases isn't particularly good. But the damage has already happened. This judge has already been reassigned or taken off her cases. And the message has been made very clear to judges that they are not safe from criminal prosecution in this administration.
I do have to ask, though, if the facts are as alleged by the administration and any other persons knew that someone else was being pursued by law enforcement and gave them some means of escape, wouldn't they be prosecuted?
Not necessarily. So, I haven't handled immigration prosecution, so I don't want to overstate my expertise here. But the primary statute under which she was charged requires corrupt intent, threat of force, or other kind of intimidation here, which, at least based on the allegations in the government's own documents, there hasn't been anything close to that yet. So once again, this seems like an arrest built more for headlines than for an actual prosecution.
Before we let you go, can you talk about why people should be paying attention to these issues? This seems all very technical. Can you just give us a sense of why you think it's important to pay attention to these kinds of very specific issues and these very specific prosecutions and allegations and these kinds of developments?
I would tell your viewers to not underestimate your own power here. Having been on the inside of government, I can tell you protest, outreach, outrage really matters. It changes how people inside a government think. It changes how judges think. And so the more attention that can be brought to attacks on the Constitution, attacks on the rule of law, it empowers people inside a government to resist unconstitutional or illegal actions. It empowers judges to stand up for what's right. And so even if you don't necessarily see the exact consequence of paying attention and speaking out, I can assure you that you are having an effect.
Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you.